Pakistan is in the crosshairs of climate change. For the past 2 months, we've been in the headlines of various international news outlets, and we've been covering the stories from Pakistan's various regions affected by the worst floods ever recorded. And this is in the backdrop 33 million people affected directly or indirectly. But we also continuously hear Pakistan is among the most vulnerable countries. In fact, we're in the top 10 most vulnerable countries. What does it mean to be vulnerable? What it means is that Pakistan is at risk of long-term impacts of climate change. But to understand it more deeply, we'll take a deep dive into what it means to be vulnerable to climate change. The Vulnerability Index is formally called the Climate Risk Index. A public policy NGO called German Watch, based in Bonn, Germany, releases this annually, and for its long-term climate risk index, the CRI, Pakistan has been ranked as the 8th most vulnerable. The CRI itself looks into past 2 decades data and records the number of people affected, the number of people per capita affected, losses per GDP, and also absolute losses in US dollar terms. Climate change is a phenomenon that affects the world over. Pakistan in particular is vulnerable because as the planet warms, its own snow reserves or ice caps will melt at a faster rate, which means that there will be more water in Pakistan's rivers and streams, and also more water in the sea. This certainly means that anyone living close to the rivers is going to be vulnerable, the sea level is going to rise, and our day-to-day activities or settlements and agriculture, all of it is going to be affected. The Vulnerability Index accounts only for extreme events. All these slow onset events are actually not accounted for. So Pakistan's vulnerability actually be underplayed in this index. What we need to really assess is how vulnerable, if we account for all these different micro onset events, is Pakistan. The Vulnerability Index assesses vulnerability on the basis of number of deaths per capita, the damages in US dollar terms, and the percentage of GDP affected. So in a sense, is measuring partly human impact and economic impact. But what is the real vulnerability of Pakistan? That still remains to be answered. Before going deeply into the understanding of vulnerability, we really need to simplify climate change or global warming for everyone. Global warming is a phenomenon that has been researched and studied for the past many decades. It basically means that our Earth, where 8 billion people now live, is warming up. The temperatures around us are warming. Everywhere we live is going to be much more hotter. As a result, the heat traps into the Earth's atmosphere and starts melting snow at accelerated risk. Your sea levels will rise, your existing storage of water, which is the glaciers in the North and South Poles, and also the northern areas of Pakistan is going to melt at accelerated risk. You'll have more and more stronger monsoons, more extreme rainfall events, more flooding, more hurricanes, more cyclones. All of this is going to impact how humans survive. And this is only happening because we've emitted so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that we've really nudged the natural system to go into this anomaly. Pakistan's vulnerability really needs to be understood in a much more comprehensive manner. It needs to go beyond flashy headlines. It needs to go beyond politicians asking for debt relief without understanding what it means to be vulnerable. For example, if you look at the floods that have hit Pakistan this year or in the past, what happens is that Pakistan receives a huge amount of water. It leads to infrastructural damages and livelihoods lost for people associated with income opportunities in the rural areas or in the urban areas. Cities like Karachi, Islamabad, Peshawar, Lahore, if they face infrastructural damages, of course, a lot of activities cannot take place. On the flip side, if we have water shortages, if we have droughts, people cannot consume enough food. They'll develop health risks, they'll have immunity issues. And as we reach into the really crisis years of climate change, a lot of this is going to be more extreme. So how do we really assess vulnerability? Scientists around the world release reports studying climate phenomena, and in particular, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change releases a report annually talking about how different regions are going to be affected. In Pakistan, we have the Global Change Impact Study Center, which releases the impacts Pakistan is going to face based on what it calls different agroclimatic zones. Now, all of these zones, this is the regions across Pakistan, such as regions in Punjab, which receive monsoon rainfall, such as regions in Balochistan, which receive western rainfalls. So the impacts are different. Pakistan is a very highly water-dependent country, so the impacts come from changes in the water cycle. Any year, if we do not have enough rainfall, it will impact us. Any year, if we have too much rainfall, it is going to impact us. So in a sense, our impact, vulnerability, is directly linked to what happens to the water cycle. The pathways to vulnerability are many. For Pakistan, for example, if there's more rainfall, which is very much likely in a warmer world, as rainfall is triggered by evaporation and comes down from clouds. So in a warmer world, we are going to be very, very vulnerable to much more flooding. We're going to be vulnerable to infrastructural losses. We're going to be vulnerable to agricultural losses from massive rural flooding. So in this sense, we know how vulnerability is going to come to us. We just really don't know how massive it is going to be. And that is assessment that needs to happen within Pakistan. Much of this vulnerability is not our own doing. It actually comes from the emissions of big developed countries such as the United States. So this is where the government comes in and says that as a country, as a part of the developing world, the losses we're facing are being caused by the damages done by the global north. This is where the whole debate of loss and damage comes. And instead of debt relief or instead of flashy claims, this is what Pakistan needs to focus on, and that's how we're going to maintain sustainable development as we become more climate resilient. Loss and damage is something that Pakistan really needs. We need to ask for damages. How much we already have borne and how much we expect in the future is something that we really need to answer. And this is what we'll be discussing in the next episode.